Hi. Today what we're going to do is talk a bit about fiscal and monetary policy in the euro area. And we're going to talk about fiscal and monetary policy because we got two stories that we want to tell. One is about the latest German fiscal package, and the other is about the ECB monetary policy decision. Now, both of these stories broke on Thursday, the 4th of June. Although the fiscal package had been debated somewhat before that. And so they're sort of collided together, but I think they're important to tell at the same time. The German fiscal package story is the easy story to tell. What the German Grand Coalition government did is they initially started out with a proposal to have a fiscal package of about 100 billion euros, which is a really big fiscal package when you compare it to what they're able to do in countries like Italy or even France. And yet the coalition couldn't quite agree because the Social Democrats held out for more. And the expectation was that this would be a very difficult negotiation. And then suddenly, with a very quick breakthrough, they came out with this huge proposal, 130 billion euros, that includes a whole variety of things that are really interesting for us to look at. So, for example, the one that the BBC picked up on is the 300 euro per child benefit. That's really only a small part of the package. It's about 4.2 billion overall, but it's important money because as soon as that money gets into households, it will be spent. The other, I think, more important element is this 25 billion fund for small businesses. This is really for businesses in the hotel, restaurant, and catering space. So it's going to absorb some of the impact of the weak tourist season, and that's going to be really good because those are firms that are actually really hard to support, and the government has set aside money for that. So I think that's an important thing in the German context. The bigger thing is the reduction in the VAT from 19% to 16%. There's a reduction on the restricted VAT as well from 7 to 5, and this is an expensive measure, but the idea is just to lower prices and encourage people to go back into shops. For those of you in the United States, the VAT is built into the price. So when you reduce that value-added taxation, then the price of goods should at least in theory, fall, and that should bring consumers out, right? And the hope is that this is going to work well to stimulate the economy. The expectation is that this is going to cost somewhere north of about 20 billion euros. And then on top of that, there's this giant 50 billion investment fund that they're going to use to invest in digital and green technologies and hopefully improve the industrial structure. So they're going to do some structural reform in German industry. Now, I think this is really good because Germany plays such a vital role in European supply chains. So we've been arguing for years and years that Germany should have more fiscal stimulus. Well, now we're seeing the fiscal stimulus. It's going to be important for the German economy, but it's going to help the economies of Central and Eastern Europe and also Northern Italy as well, as it draws in resources from those countries in order to drive the German manufacturing base. But when you look at the comparison between what Germany is doing and what other countries are doing, you see that this is not a level playing field. And I don't say that in a bad way. I do wish that there was some way better to equalize what's going on, right? The guys at Bruegel have a fabulous COVID national data set where they look at fiscal responses, and they break them up into immediate fiscal impulse, tax deferrals, and liquidity guarantees. The data is not all precisely comparable because it gets updated whenever a new package is agreed. But for example, the latest Italian package hasn't been agreed, so it hasn't been folded into this, and the Italian numbers look a little bit low in that context. Once it's agreed, it'll get folded in, and you'll see the fiscal response. But the fiscal response in Germany is just orders of magnitude above anywhere else, right? So just in terms of immediate fiscal impulse after this package, we're looking at something north of about 13% of GDP, whereas for France, we're looking at something around 3.6%, right? So these are very different orders of magnitude, and the German economy should be much better insulated from the impact of this crisis as a result. And you have to worry that the economies of these other parts of Europe are going to suffer. Now, I say these other parts of Europe, look at the numbers for Spain, right? I've already mentioned that Italy hasn't folded in the latest package yet, but the numbers for Spain are updated as to the end of May, so we're not expecting those numbers to increase dramatically. And in terms of immediate fiscal impulse and tax deferral, the numbers for Spain are very, very low. So the Spanish economy is really not well insulated, and it's about to go into a very hot, very uncomfortable summer with very few foreign tourists to sustain it. So in that sense, I think we need to look at the fiscal package in Germany, both on the positive side, this is great that Germany can do this, and on the negative side, isn't it unfortunate that all these other countries are left out of the cold to a certain extent? And so we really have to hope that this European Recovery Fund, Next Generation EU, that we talked about last time, does come together and come together quickly in order to provide the kind of support that we would like to see spread across the euro area so that divergences within the euro area don't increase any more than they will already as a result of this crisis, right? I mean, anything we can do to mitigate that divergence, I think, is going to be important. I keep saying we. I mean, I don't do any of this. This is policymakers. I'm glad Germany's doing what it's doing, but I wish that kind of effort could be made across the euro area as a whole. The one thing that we have across the euro area as a whole is obviously the ECB, and the ECB is under enormous pressure to act. The chief economist of the ECB, Philip Lane, is the one I'm featuring next to the monetary package. He's the one typically who presents the recommendations for the monetary package when they have their monetary policy meetings. And this time he made a presentation we'll read about later when the monetary account comes out, but he made a presentation, obviously, that had some impact. Impact in what sense? Well, they've decided to increase by 600 billion euros the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. That was the program that was announced on the 18th of March with an envelope of 750 to make purchases. We've talked about it every week, and we've been counting down how fast they've been burning through that program. Well, 600 billion should extend the life of this program up into somewhere about February. And I say that it extends the life of the program. That's at the current burn rate up into about February, because they've got 1.35 trillion euros to spend. But crucially, what the Governing Council said is, look, they plan for the PEP to go all the way into June 2021. So it's possible that we could see a further increase down the line. One of the journalists in the press conference asked why there wasn't a bigger number now. I think that the response to that is an appropriate response, which is we still don't know what conditions are going to look like. Why would we try to max it out now? Let's just give ourselves enough money so that we can keep this program going as long as we need, which is going to extend it beyond the original expiration date, and crucially give them time to look at what the data looks like in the in the autumn, and as a result, take that further if necessary. Now, the more surprising elements had to do with the fact that they're going to keep reinvesting any principal that matures in this program until 2022. That means that this program is actually going to have a lasting impact on liquidity provision at least until 2022, and possibly even beyond that. And at the same time, they're going to maintain the public sector purchase program at 20 billion a month, or actually this should be the full asset purchase program at 20 billion a month, plus the 120 that they announced on the 12th of March. So there's going to be a lot of quantitative easing going on. And on that asset purchase program, the assets for which are about 2.8 trillion right now. For the asset purchase program, they're going to keep reinvesting the maturing principal until after any increase in policy rates, which basically means indefinitely, because once we get to the inflation forecasts, you're going to see that they're not going to be increasing policy rates anytime soon. So in that sense, I think this is a very generous monetary package. They kept the interest rates on hold, but who cares? They've actually intervened in a very powerful way, and the market response was immediate. You saw a big drop in the spread, for example, between Italian and German sovereign debt. Having said that, there was a press conference after the monetary policy was announced, and there were some interesting things that came out of the press conference. I want to talk about three of these things in particular. I've put the link in case you want to watch the press conference. I do encourage you to watch it because it's a very interesting demonstration of how economics and politics interact in real time in the context of financial journalism. But let's focus on the three things that I think are important: the revised forecast, the German Constitutional Court, which was the subject of endless questioning, and the pressure on ECB communication. Now, the revised forecast is actually deeply, deeply, deeply depressing. What you see on the left-hand side of your screen is where they think macroeconomic output is going to be from year on year, and the base of 100 is actually 2019. And what you see is that there's going to be a huge drop in macroeconomic output that's going to persist. That they had not expected. The blue line at the top of your screen was what they had projected when they first met on March the 12th. The yellow line, or the yellow dots, these are all black dotty connections, but the yellow dots are where they're projecting things now this June. And there are 2 points I want you to note. One is that the line has shifted way down, and the other is that in 2022 we're still going to be below baseline. That suggests that there is going to be scarring, that this is going to take a long time to recover from this crisis, and that is the projection they're making right now, and that projection has attached to it a downside risks. In other words, it could get worse than that. Now, this is the output projection. On the right-hand side of your screen is the inflation projection. You've got headline inflation on the left-hand side in the left panel, and you've got what we call core inflation on the right panel. Let's just stick with the core inflation. What it's showing you is that core inflation is going to remain below 1% into 2022, right? Headline inflation, if we switch back to the left-hand panel, is not, by 2022, is not going to be anywhere close to 2%. In other words, the ECB is expecting to be well below its target of an expected medium-term rate of inflation of below but close to 2% per annum for the next 3 years. There is not going to be an end to this monetary accommodation until those inflation rates come up, and they're not going to come up until we respond for the crisis. So what we're seeing is that the forecasts are deeply depressing, and the ECB is really pulling out all the stops in order to respond. But pay attention to this, monetary policy alone cannot respond. That's why the fiscal policy story comes up first. The forecasts are depressing. They're putting out a big monetary response, but there needs to be some kind of fiscal companion for that response to work. By the same token, we've been expressing concern about the German Constitutional Court, and so did the journalists. They asked time and again virtually the same question. And what I think is important is that the president of the ECB, Christine Lagarde, has come up with what I think is the right response, and have argued is the right response. But there is a sense of accommodation as well. The right response is that the German Constitutional Court is not speaking to the ECB, right? It's speaking to the German government and the German parliament. There's nothing that the ECB can do to make this problem go away. Only the German government and the German parliament can make this problem go away. But when they do make this problem go away, what do they have to do? They have to do something, a good solution. They have to do something that doesn't compromise the independence of the ECB, that doesn't compromise the primacy of European Union law, and that doesn't undermine the ruling of the European Court of Justice. This is a hard thing for the German government to do. Now, I've asked around about what the German government can do in this context and what happens if it doesn't do anything. And the surprising answer I got is that the German Constitutional Court, the Second Senate of the German Constitutional Court, the German Constitutional Court can issue this kind of ruling against the German government, but it really has no sanction attached to it. The whole thing is predicated on the assumption that the German government will respond to the moral suasion attached to this rule of law. And so the German government could just ignore this. And there would be no consequences except for the precedent that it would set, which would be really bad. So I think we have to pay attention to this. But remember, this is an intramural German problem, which is not to say it's not having an impact on the ECB. And there were lots of questions about that as well. And what you're seeing in ECB communications is a repeated emphasis on the notion of proportionality that was raised by the German Constitutional Court. So I would argue that the German Constitutional Court, despite the fact that it's done us all kinds of disservices in terms of the supremacy of EU law, may have done us a service in the sense that it's got the ECB to come out much more clearly and reiterate the proportionality of these measures. So they're appropriate measures and they're proportionate measures. and the communication is improving in that sense. Which is not to say that the communication is perfect. And this is the last point I want to make. Look, there is a problem. I've talked to journalists from the room. There's a problem, which is that everybody goes in and they all have the same questions, and then they ask the same questions over and over again. And the poor journalist who's the last person to ask the question has had all their good questions asked. And they're supposed to ask two questions. And in this case, the poor journalist at the end of this process was the AFP journalist Jean-Philippe Lacour, who got to ask the last question. And the question is really, what is he supposed to add? So and here I'm speculating, but you can just imagine him sort of scratching his head and going, oh, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And he starts off in French, switches to English, and says, look, do you think the size of this recovery fund will be enough? Which is, how is she supposed to answer that? I'm not quite sure. And then he asks the second question. And the second question is just one of these things where you put your head in your hand and you go, oh no, do you really want to ask this question? And the second question was, allow me please, but you're often seen reading notes in response to questions of journalists. Is it your own style you wanted to print in the ECB communication? I'm not quite sure what the last part of that question means, but the first part is pretty obvious to me, which is that he's challenging Christine Lagarde by suggesting that she doesn't really know what she's talking about. And that brings up very bitter memories of the 12th of March. And you can see in her eyes when she turns to this part of the question that she is not best pleased with having to ask this. And the leadoff sentence, I mean, it's been a long day, it's been a long 2 days, it's been a long press conference, and the leadoff sentence really betrays the sense of stress that's going on. And she says, first of all, you don't know what I'm reading. And then she goes on to explain why it's important. And then and she has this thing about, I'm sorry you don't see my eyes. In that case, you don't miss too much. Having said that, I think it is important. Her communication has improved, right? Their communication has improved. And critically, what the ECB has done is they've created this ECB blog. Now, I can't say that I was always a huge fan of the ECB blog, but now I really am, because what you do is you get to see the opening statement, you get to see the press conference question and answer, and then you have the ECB blog, which comes out and reinforces it and gives you some of the graphical material that you otherwise wouldn't have. So all of those forecast graphs, for example, and even the picture of Philip Lane came from the ECB blog. So what I would say is there's a lot more pressure on ECB communication, but ECB communication is stepping up its game. Having said that, I think there's reason for optimism. We're seeing a rapid and loosely coordinated response with the potential for the EU to add a bit more if these negotiations go well. But this crisis is enormous. It's much bigger than anybody had anticipated. And I think most troubling of all, the worst is yet to come. So we're going to have to keep watching this closely and hoping that the response continues to ratchet up. I can say, having watched the last crisis and the current crisis, even though this crisis is bigger than the last one was, the response is more immediate and better coordinated. So there are reasons for optimism, even if the whole situation is deeply disturbing. Anyway, thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week.